Mind's Work is a book I just finished reading and writing, and it's about the future of learning. I have a lot to cover, so I'll get right to it. I recently got a phone call from a friend of mine, Julie, and she runs a large L&D organization for IBM. We worked together for many years, and Julie was very distressed. She had a question for me. People were coming up to her and saying, we make training programs, we develop learning and development, and people don't seem to have the time to go to those training programs anymore, so what are we going to do in the future? We're not going to have any work. And I don't know what to tell them. Julie was saying to me, I don't know what to tell my own people. And I said to her, we just did a lot of research on the future of learning and where it's headed, and I think we have an answer for you that will not only be helpful, but will be hopeful. We started looking at companies in Silicon Valley because we thought they had a new way of learning. Companies like Google and Amazon. And if you look at these companies, they do things very differently than traditional companies. But what we found out was much more interesting. We discovered that there are really two kinds of companies in the world right now, and you work for one or the other. The first company we called companies that existed during the Industrial Revolution. And they were developed when we made lots of things with our hands. We always worked with our hands for a long period of time in the Industrial Revolution. And the need for management and learning had to do with what we did with our hands. And just to make things easy for ourselves, we named those companies Managing Hands Companies. And they're a model of companies that have been used for over 200 years now. And it's probably the kind of company, when we get into the details of what those companies are like, that you find yourself working for. The other company is the company we started looking at in Silicon Valley, where I'm from, in California. And all the work in those companies are done with people's minds. Nobody produces anything except what they produce with their mind. And for comparison, we call those companies Managing Mind Companies. And each of those companies showed us how minds work in companies and how people learn and are managed, but they're very, very different. We decided, after we figured out there were these two different companies, to then start to look at the different characteristics that distinguish them from one another, because they are incredibly different. And usually when we think of companies and we think of management and learning, we don't think of these two different companies as separate and not equal. There were 5 characteristics that we looked at, and I'll go over each one of them now. The first characteristic was command and control is the way the Managing Hands companies were modeled. They were built that way because you needed to control lots and lots of hands, doing lots and lots of things, and making things all over the place. And so the learning and the management in these traditional companies focused on how you could control people, and the control came from what is usually the hierarchical management model that all of us have experienced, where one person or a few people at the top know everything that's happening in the company, and everybody at the bottom does all the work. I've been at the bottom and the top, so I know the command and control model very well. In the newer companies, command and control was replaced by what's called communication and collaboration. When we started to look at these newer companies, what we saw was that instead of command and control, with all the information flowing in one direction down from the top, there was a much greater need for people to use their minds, because they weren't using their hands anymore to make things. All the work was coming out of their minds, and the idea was to enable their minds and empower them as much as possible to use their minds as effectively as possible. So they replaced command and control in these companies with collaborate and communicate. The second feature that we found, most of us have experienced the old idea that knowledge is power. If I'm working in one of these traditional Managing Hands model companies, and I know something and you don't, I become more powerful than you. If I know something's happening next week and you haven't learned about it yet, I can react more quickly and I can gain the advantage. So knowledge is power became another characteristic of these companies that are managing hands, these traditional companies that came out of the Industrial Revolution. In the newer companies, the companies that are using the model of managing minds, the new idea wasn't knowledge is power, but sharing knowledge is power. And it's really interesting because in these companies that are using this new model of managing minds, you find that people are much more adept at communicating and collaborating, which is one of the first characteristics. And what that leads to is a much greater sharing of what people know. And they're all working together so that they can learn from one another. And knowledge sharing becomes just part of the way the company is operated. Now, it's very interesting to me when you walk into one of these companies, into the companies that are either managing hands or managing minds. The companies that are managing hands are very quiet. Think of walking into a financial company or a bank, a company that has a lot of control. There's not much going on. These companies are very quiet. People walk along like this. They're not talking, their heads down. They're in their offices with the doors closed. Companies that are managing hands tend to be very controlled and controlling. When you go to the other side and you work with the companies that are managing minds, it feels very different. The energy is incredibly different. If you stand there sometimes, it feels like the convention floor here. There's a tremendous amount happening. People are moving all around. They're talking to one another. And the energy is very different. So in order to distinguish between the two, we called the space that people are working in the managing hands companies, workspaces, and in the other managing mind model, we call their space learning spaces. And we called it that because the purpose of those spaces are to help people start to learn and to share knowledge with one another. Again, this all lines up. They're collaborating and they're communicating, they're sharing knowledge, and they're working in a learning space. The managing hands companies are very siloed. Information flows one way, it's unidirectional, and it flows from the top down. And there's lots of secrets in these companies. Not everybody knows everything, and very few people know what's going on. And you may be on a team, and you may not even know what the manager knows, and the manager doesn't know what that manager knows, and nobody knows what the people at the top knows because it's all held very closely. The information is a secret. That inhibits learning. So in these companies where learning is not that important, that's okay. Secrets and silos work. If you go to the other side where you're managing minds, there are no secrets. And the reason for that is, in order not to disable learning, if everybody knows everything that's going on in the company becomes smarter. It's much more effective. All the minds are working in the company. They all know what's happening. In some of the companies I will talk about in a minute, they even practice what's called open book management, where people in the company actually know and understand the financials of the company. They can say on any given day what's happening to the company, how they're doing, and there are no secrets. That's another big difference between these two types of companies. Now, we don't even think of the difference between these two types of companies because we're most likely working in one and not the other, and it's just the way we do business. But it's important for the future of learning because the way we do business impacts on what we're going to do in the future. The final thing we noticed, and that's most important in this conference for learning and development, in the companies that use the managing hands model, learning is pushed. It's part of that command and control approach. People are told to go to training. The training is already developed for them. It's very controlled. And the environment for them is when you go to training, we're going to tell you what you need to learn, and you're going to learn it, and you're going to leave the training and move on. And that's what happens in these managing hands companies. Training is pushed out to you. In the companies that are managing minds, it's really fascinating. knowledge and know-how seems to surround you. It's almost like Google is for us. If you want to learn something, you go to Google and you find out what you need to learn, and you pull it to you. In the companies that are managing minds, learning is pulled. It's not pushed. Learning is everywhere. It's as if the people in the company are living in a knowledge bubble, and they can find the information they need in lots of different ways. They can get it on their cell phone by calling somebody. They can go to their tablet. They can get on the phone. They can go to their laptop. It doesn't matter how they get the information. Some of it may be training, some of it may be the old push model, but for the most part, it's all pull. And it happens all the time, and it happens in as many ways as you can imagine, and it happens all day long. It's 24/7. Knowledge is out there for them. They pull it when they need it, and they learn it. This was part of the problem that my friend Julie was hearing about from the people who work for her, and that is people don't have the time anymore to be trained. People don't want to spend that time and schedule it. They just want to learn what they need to learn, when they need to learn it, and how they want to learn it, and move on. So these new companies that are managing minds are companies where learning is everywhere, and people are always learning. It's a continuous process, and that's another huge distinction. If you think about the companies that are managing hands, learning is an occasion. You get sent to it, it's an event. It happens every now and then, and you do the best you can. In these new model companies that are using managing minds as their model, learning happens always. It's always on. When you're working as a researcher and a writer, you're always hoping for what I call the wow moment. And the wow moment for us happened when we realized that we were in the middle of something that was historic. It had never happened before. And it became the basis for the book. What we realized that had changed was that we had moved from one kind of labor and work to another. We took a look at the Industrial Revolution that was very labor intensive. People work with their hands. It was managing hands model for companies. And that had gone on for 200 years, and then we thought for a minute and we said, well, it's actually gone on for much longer than that. It's gone on through the Agricultural Revolution, it's gone on throughout the Industrial Revolution, and we had this incredible history of labor-intensive work where management and learning were done in a very certain way. In 1980, something happened. Something very dramatic happened. And we moved to what we started to think of as a mind-intensive world. Instead of being labor-intensive, where work was done with your hands, more and more people were moving to a place where they were working with their mind. And this was happening all over the planet. Now, I can imagine that all of you here today work with your minds. Most of the time, in most of the webinars and the discussions I've had with people, they work with their minds. I haven't had anybody raise their hand and say, at the end of the week, I have something to show you that I made with my hands. So we work with our minds. And there's a distinction that's important here. In the factories that use the managing hands model, there were people who worked with their minds. They did analysis, they created new machinery, but they were in the minority. Most of the people in those businesses worked with their hands. In the managing mind model, most of the people, if not all of them, are working with their minds and producing work with their minds. And something happened in 1980. 1980, if you think about it, was less than 50 years ago. Less than 50 years ago is not history. That's my lifetime, and that's probably most of your lifetime. So less than 50 years ago, this amazing historic thing happened where we shifted from a labor-intensive universe to a mind-intensive world in terms of work. And we were asking ourselves, what is it that happened in 1980 that was so important? And how does that impact on management and learning going into the future? What we realized is that there are four major forces that converged around 1980 and have been converging ever since and supporting one another in a way that accelerates them and makes them even more powerful going forward. We all have experienced technology and know what's going on there. All of us, I'm sure, have mobile phones, and we all work with laptops, and we all have tablets, and probably our children do as well. Technology's become a pervasive part of our lives since 1980. What we may not realize as much is that automation and artificial intelligence have also been growing and becoming part of our lives. And these three forces working together became an overwhelming force that, in our opinion, when we were doing the research, becomes irresistible and unstoppable. There's nothing we can do about it going forward, despite the fact that we would like to go backward, we can't. So in 1980, these forces started to converge and move us from a labor-intensive world to a mind-intensive world, from a world where we're managing hands to a world where we're just managing minds. Take automation for an example. Automation has found its way into obvious places in the past 20 years, 30 years, where it's taking over most of the manual jobs that we used to do. Automation is replacing labor in factories, but it's replacing lots of labor in other places that you wouldn't imagine. In California, in Palo Alto, which is a city near Stanford University, there's a pizza parlor. And the pizza parlor is called Zoom Pizza, Z-U-M-A Pizza. And you go in, you order your pizza, and it comes out. And if you want to go into the kitchen to thank the people for making it, what you find is that there's Marta, and there's Pepe, and there's Francisco, and they're all robots. Your pizza is made by automation. Marta puts the cheese and the tomato sauce. Pepe puts it in the oven. It's made perfectly. It comes out to you. And your pizza is made by automation. It's just one of the ways that one of these forces, again, is finding our way into our life more and more every single day. Artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence has had stops and starts over the last 50 years since 1980. But in the last 5 years, it's suddenly gained some traction and some serious traction. Artificial intelligence helps your doctors make a diagnosis. Artificial intelligence helps your financial analysts decide what stocks and bonds that you should buy. Artificial intelligence does a lot of things behind the scenes, and it's becoming more and more a part of our life again. I held globalization to the end because it's one of my forces that I think is the most powerful. And the reason I think it's the most powerful is that right now, as we're talking, and as we're standing here and as we're milling around in the conference, all over the world, there are people working on technology breakthroughs in automation, and pushing artificial intelligence forward as fast as they can. So globalization is driving all these other three forces, and all these four forces combined become an unstoppable force that started in 1980 that's moving us from a labor-intensive to a mind-intensive world, from managing minds to managing hands. Now, the impact of this on management and learning is profound. When we started working in California, looking at what we thought were the new emerging companies, the Googles and the Amazons, companies you've all heard about, they were managing mind companies. What we found to our surprise is that companies that are managing minds exist all over the world in every single industry. And since 1980, there have been more and more of them. It started out with what we thought was a trend, and it actually has turned into what we're now considering a worldwide movement. A worldwide movement of companies that are adopting this managing hands model. Companies that are doing this exist on a continuum. They exist on a continuum from traditional to transitional to what we call aspirational. On the traditional side of the spectrum, those are the companies that are doing nothing but managing hands. They're companies that are still focused on making things on people's hands, on control, command, secrets, workspaces and pushing knowledge and pushing training out. On the other side of the spectrum, you have companies that are tremendously aspirational, and they're companies that have adopted almost completely all the things that a company that wants to manage minds does. In the middle, that's where most of us probably live right now, and that's where most of our companies are. They started out as traditional, they were managing hands, they're looking at companies that are managing minds and seeing it's a much more advantageous way of doing business, and they're trying to figure out where the bridge is. What we decided to look at were the companies that we called aspirational, and those are the companies that were completely and absolutely dedicated to the model of managing minds. Now, we wanted to find out why they were so successful, because we wanted to understand how this model really worked. The first company we looked at is a company in the UK, UKTV, and they're based in Wales, and they're run by Darren Childs, who's their CEO. They started out as a managing hand company. They were very command and control oriented. There were lots of secrets. They had people working on 2 separate floors in a building. People weren't interacting too much. There wasn't too much going on. And Darren Childs said, we can do better. He said, this has to change. And he made the change from managing hands to managing minds. And the result was pretty dramatic. He moved from a 4% market share to a 10% market share, doubled the value of the company very quickly. So the results show that what he did was successful from the point of view of business. But was it successful from the point of view of the way people were operating? Did it help people learn? Now, some of the things he did is, for example, he took the ceiling away and he opened up the space. So suddenly, instead of working on 2 separate floors and people hardly ever communicating with one another, when he took the ceiling away and he put in lots of stairs, suddenly he found the space opened up and people started to open up. They started to interact more. In other words, they went from command and control to more collaborating and communicating. He thought that was a good thing. He liked it. He said, let's see what else we can do. So he took away the managers' offices because he found the managers were hiding and they were separating themselves from the people who were doing the work, and there wasn't as much collaboration as he wanted. Took away the managers' offices, more open, more collaboration. He still wanted more, and he found that people were huddled at their own little desks. And so he said, well, no more desks. Everybody now is what he called an office nomad. And what that meant was that everybody was now interacting with everybody else. He made sure that everybody could use their technology effectively because he wanted technology to be used for collaboration and communication. He made sure that there are a lot of plugs in the office, for example. In the original model, when the architect had built it, there were just enough plugs for the few things that you usually plug in, like the Xerox machine. But he made sure there were plugs for people to plug in their phones, recharge their laptops, do whatever they needed to do. There were a lot of outlets for people to get their technology to work so that it enabled the collaboration and communication he knew was needed in a company that was practicing a mind-intensive model. And then he kept going. He didn't stop there. He instituted weekly town hall meetings where people could get together and share what they had learned. And it was very interesting. In his mind, sharing what I learned is not only sharing my successes with all of you, it's sharing my failures. Because what he understood is that people learn as much from their failures as their successes, and he took away all the penalties that you would normally experience in the managing hands world if you failed at something. And he made it okay to fail. So in these weekly town hall meetings, people could say, well, we tried this and it didn't work, and everybody who was there could learn something. Because suddenly, in this new model company of managing minds, learning became the most important thing that people could do. Every single day, all the time, it was all about learning. He also created a series of core values. Instead of having lots of rules and regulations, which is one of the hallmarks of these managing hands companies, he created a set of core values. He made sure that there were posters all over the office so that everybody every day could see what these values were and could live by them. They started to recruit for values rather than for talent. He wanted to make sure that people who came into the workplace culture were happy there. Because if they weren't happy there, it didn't matter what they knew. They couldn't work together with other people effectively, and the company couldn't be as smart as it could possibly be. And finally, he placed the most important value on learning. He said, in our company going forward, the most important thing we're going to be able to do is learn and share what we learn with one another and collaborate and communicate. Now, he has a great quote, and I like the last part of his quote where he's talking about in a managing mind company, in a company where most of the work is produced with the mind, if the organization doesn't support that creativity, if it doesn't enable it instead of disable it, then you're not going to get as much creativity as possible from people, and the company is just not going to succeed. So this is one example of one of the companies that we consider leading edge in this new world of mind-intensive work where all work is done with our minds and we're managing minds. Another company that I want us to look at is a company right here in France called Avec. And they're located up in Helincourt, which is north of us. And they were run by a former CEO, Jean-François Zobrist. I've practiced that a lot knowing I'm going to present in France. And in 1983, he began to radically change the company. He made some dramatic changes because he realized that they weren't succeeding as a manufacturing company, and their model was very traditional. They were over here on the managing hand side. They were all about command and control, and they had to change. So he instituted some very simple steps. The first thing he did, for example, was take away the time clock. Now, if you've ever worked in a factory or a manufacturing environment, you live and die by that time clock. You punch in the morning because it knows you're there, and on your way out, you punch out. Well, the first thing is he took it away. There's no time clock at the door anymore. People just came to work, and when they were done, they went home. He opened up the vending machines. If you wanted a drink, you went to the vending machine, you got one. If you wanted something to eat, you went to the vending machine and you got something. And he basically started to open the environment and treat people as if they were more than just a pair of hands coming to work for him every day. He changed the model. He got much more serious at one point, and he started to focus on communicating and collaborating. He said to everybody who worked there, part of your job now is to talk to other people who are working there and to communicate and collaborate with them as much as possible, to share your knowledge as often as you can. He began open and transparent management. It's another hallmark of these managing minds companies. No more secrets. People knew what was going on in the company, and everybody knew at every moment how well the company was doing, and if they had a bad week, people decided to work a little harder because they were all invested and they were completely engaged in the success of the company. Everybody was involved, full participation of all the employees. And he said sharing learning is the key to your job. It wasn't go to your station, punch in on your time clock, and do your work every day, make a number of widgets so that you meet your quota, and then go home. Learn what you can and share what you learn, and that's your new model of success here in my company. So they moved the company from a managing hand side to the managing mind side. And he has a quote, and I love the last part of his quote, because he says, initially we hired people for their muscles. In other words, he was hiring hands. And what he really wanted most was for people to have their minds and their hearts engaged in his company. So he wanted a company that was managing minds. And that's what he did with Avec. He changed it. And the company, as I showed you in the beginning, became incredibly successful. They went from a negative cash flow to a positive cash flow in a very short period of time, just because he made this change in the model that he used. The next company to take a quick look at is Nearsoft. Nearsoft is a company you would assume is a managing mind company because they make software. Software is all produced with people working with their mind. And the problem with Nearsoft was they had come out of the old model of managing hands because that's the default model for the way we build companies. We build companies thinking that we need command and control. We build companies thinking secrets are okay. We build companies think it's okay that knowledge is power, and I'm not going to tell you what I know because I want to be more powerful. They had some of these old legacy models, and they needed to get rid of them to be as effective as possible. So they began to change what they did. The first thing that the founders did was they made an emphasis on freedom. They took away the rules because rules get in the way of people learning to do things. Rules force you into this control mode where you don't share what you know and you don't collaborate and you don't communicate, and so they got rid of the rules. Pretty simple decision. They just got rid of the rules. And like UKTV, he set up a series of what he called core values, and there were 5 of them, and the one that I think is the most important is the last one. Being smart and getting things done. If you stop to think about it, in order to be smart, you have to learn. In order to get things done, you have to know what you're doing, which means you have to learn. So implicit in this statement is the emphasis again on learning. The managing hands companies, you learn occasionally, and you may not even need to know what you're learning. And you may be able to use it someday, but it's not that important. On the other side, in a managing mind company, learning is everything. And so what we started to see, just by looking at these companies that are on the leading edge, is that learning was becoming at the center of the operation of the company instead of on the periphery. And that meant for us that the future of learning started to look brighter and brighter than it had when we started. Just like UKTV, Nearsoft started to believe that no matter what you learned, learning was important. They had something that Google has, which is you can take one day of the week off and you can go learn whatever you want to learn. Now, a lot of people in a managing hands world would think that's crazy. I pay you to be here 40 hours a week. I'm not paying you to take a day off and learn something about canoeing. I'm not paying you to take a day off and learn about mushrooms. I'm paying you to be a mushroom. I'm paying you to stay here and learn all the time what you're doing and focus on that, not go off and do what you want to do. But in Nearsoft, what they decided that any learning is good learning, and the process of learning somehow or another adds to what everybody in the company knows if you share it and if you share that knowledge. So again, learning moved from the outside to the center, from the margin and the periphery to the very center, to the heart, to the DNA of the company. Now there's one more company I want to go over quickly before I end. And that's Semco. Semco was a manufacturing company that was very traditional managing hands company. And Semco then became the Semco Group, but when it was still Semco in the 1980s, the founder of the company was Ricardo Stemler, and he was the CEO at the time. And he had just graduated from Harvard getting his MBA. Now, one of the wonderful things about business schools is that they came out of that managing hands industrial world. And their model of how to run a company is strictly managing hands. They teach you how to do a great job when you're managing hands, and your model for a company is managing hands. They teach you about command and control. They teach you how to run financials and do all the things that you normally do, but they don't teach you anything about how to manage minds. There's not one course in any business school that we studied that talks about learning. They don't exist because learning is not that important, they think, when it comes to running a company that's managing hands. Well, he came back from his MBA program and he went back to his hometown in Sao Paulo, Brazil, where the company was. And it was about 1980. And there was this really wonderful moment that he had. It's a moment that I personally love. He forgot everything he had learned in Harvard. He just let go of it. And he asked a question, and to me, the question is the beginning of all learning. The question is the key that unlocks the imagination. He asked the question, why? Why am I running the company the way it's always been run? Why are we doing things the way we've always done them? why am I asking people to do things that don't make any sense anymore? And what he realized is that without putting our words to it of managing hands, he was running his company using the old model. And the company wasn't doing well, and he decided we have to change, and it doesn't make any sense. If I keep asking why, I can't come up with good answers. For example, he looked at his salespeople, and the salespeople would make their quota on a Wednesday. And his question was, well, why am I asking them to stay in the office on Thursday and Friday when their work is done by Wednesday? They can go off and do something that's much more valuable to them. They can go off and learn something they need to learn. They can go off and take care of someone they need to take care of. Or if they want to, they could go to the beach. It doesn't matter. They made their quota. There's no reason for me to have them staying here. Because if they do more than their quota, it's a problem for my factories, it's a problem for logistics, it's a problem for everyone. So he asked, why am I having them stay here past Wednesday? There is no reason, go home. He said, why is it so secretive about the way we don't share salaries with each other? Why is it that no matter how long I've worked next to you in a managing hands company, I will never ever tell you how much I'm earning? We just don't talk about that. He said, why? It's silly. And so what he did is he published everybody's salary. So suddenly everybody in the office knew what everybody else was making. Well, after they got over the shock, they suddenly realized, well, we're making about the same thing, that's okay. And then he published something about other companies that were comparable, and they said, well, we're doing better than some of these other companies, and that's a good thing. And then he said, well, why am I even setting your salary? Now that you know what everybody's making, and now that you know what they're making in other companies doing the same work, set your own salaries. Tell me what you want to earn. The changes that he was making from managing hands to managing minds were so radical that everybody thought the company was going to crash and burn. They guaranteed it. They said there's no way in the world he could make these changes and the company could succeed. Well, what happened was very funny. You will not see numbers like this for most companies anywhere ever again. 500, 600, 700% increases because he made the change from the traditional model of managing hands to this new model of managing minds, where people suddenly started to feel fully engaged in the company, and they were there to work, and they were there to succeed, and they were there to share what they knew with one another, collaborate and communicate, and they started to have all the characteristics of the managing mind companies. It became incredibly successful. And the reason I even pointed to this company is that when we started out, we thought maybe this managing mind thing started in 1980 in Silicon Valley or 2000 someplace in California. And this movement, this worldwide progressive movement for management and learning actually started in Sao Paulo, Brazil in 1980 with Semco. It's been going on for a long time. And just as an aside, he wrote several books because once the company started to get numbers like this, every financial paper and every financial magazine in the world started reporting on him and saying, he's doing a fantastic job. What's the secret sauce? They didn't understand it. Instead of crashing and burning, he was suddenly succeeding beyond his wildest dreams, and everybody wanted to know, what is he doing? What we think he was doing is managing minds. This is the question that I like, his quote, that it really sums up the question why. Don't get stuck in what you're doing when you're running a company just because it's not working. Don't keep doing it over and over again. Try something new. Use that key, open your imagination, and look forward to something different. Find a different future. The biggest lesson we learned from all of this is that the difference between a managing hand company and a managing mind company is that in a managing mind company, the means of production are in everybody's mind. The means of production are not on the production floor. They're not in the book someplace. They're not in the hands of the people doing the work. They're in the minds of the people doing the work, and that's new and different. And that's what's driving this movement around the world from managing hands to managing minds. I have a favorite author, William Gibson, and he has a quote I like, and it's about the future. And the quote is, "The future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed yet." And what that means to me is that we've seen the future in these managing minds companies and the companies that are following this managing mind model. It's already here. It's been here since Semco in 1980, and it's growing. It's a growing worldwide movement, and it has tremendous implications for learning. The thrust of it for me is that in the future, all companies will need to be managing minds. They'll have no choice. We have these two different kinds of companies, companies that are using the managing hand model and companies that are using the managing mind model. We've got these four forces that are moving us forward into the future inexorably in ways that we can't stop, and they're moving us closer into this mind-intensive world where companies are going to have to start working as if minds are the most important thing in order to get the work done. So this gets me back to, what does this mean for you, and what does it mean for my friend Julie, because that's where this started. If you define the work you do as building courses, you're forcing yourself to stay over in the managing hands world, because that's what they do. That's all about learning and development and training. You build courses, you push them out, and that's managing hands. If you define yourself as helping people learn what they need to learn, when they need to learn it, and how they need to learn it, you're moving into the new world of the future, the world of managing minds. So my answer to Julie was very simple. I said, in the future, learning and development and training, or learning in general, will be more important than it ever has been. It has to be, because in the past, it wasn't that important. People sometimes would learn what they needed on their own. Some learning was pushed out, but it was not at the center of things. In the future, in these managing mind companies, learning is going to be at the center of everything. And so the job of people who are developing training today and who are in training departments and doing learning and development will be more important than ever. There's a lot more information contained in the book, and for me, it's a collaborative effort. What I'd like to do is have you feed back to me things that you've learned from your experience in different companies and things that you're finding out that are going on even in your countries that can help inform me about how this worldwide movement is going. And now we'll take some questions.
Maybe time for one quick one, and then move kind of one more session. Probably time for one quick question, if we can.
Well, I'm concerned by the risk of being hacked, mind property stolen by competitor companies.
That's a good question, and it's a question that a lot of people who are doing managing minds, using that managing minds model are asking. And the answer is really a technical question. It's not so much changing the way you manage the company and the way people learn, but the answer is, how do you protect your intellectual property? What is it that you do when everybody's sharing knowledge and talking to one another and wandering around? It's a very interesting thing. If you go to a company like Google, Google has more patents than almost any other company in the world right now. And Google protects those patents because they treat those patents very specially, okay? So when you're working in the area of intellectual property in a company like Google, which is very much a company that's managing minds, you're even more careful than you might have been in the other model of company to protect what's yours. And that's what they're doing in these new companies. They're being even more careful, and they understand the security issues and the technology issues that are involved, because that's what they do. Does that answer your question? Good. Well, thank you again for coming. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much. All right, David, thank you so much for wonderful closing keynote.